Welcome to this short video designed to support you in identifying your priorities as required in an application for the transformed Athena Swan Charter. In this video, I will cover why it's important to identify priorities, how priorities show up in the criteria and application form, how to identify and finalise priorities, including an example, and hints and tips for different situations. This video is part of a series. Other videos in the series consider data, evaluating culture, reviewing policies, creating an action plan, and evaluating success. First of all, why is it helpful to identify priorities? We know that you're all ambitious and motivated to change things for the better, and sometimes this enthusiasm can lead to us trying to do too much. Particularly in the new framework, which is less prescriptive, defining clear priorities based on your self-assessment will create a clear structure for your plans that is tailored to your context. Defining clear priorities will ensure that your actions are focused on the areas of greatest need and oriented towards the longer-term outcomes you wish to see, to avoid dispersing your efforts. By focusing your efforts, setting priorities will help to ensure the most effective use of resources and that your plans are achievable and sustainable. To begin with, let's note that the priorities will come from your analysis of data, your culture assessment, and the review of policies. Any particular priority may be uncovered during one or more of these activities. The priorities identified should be those for your particular department, university, or institute and its goals, baseline and journey so far around gender equality. In other words, the priorities need to be tailored to you. Let's now look at where the priorities occur in the Athena Swan criteria and application. Criterion B, evidence-based recognition of the key issues facing the applicant, is underpinned by 6 expectations, of which the last one is identifying and justifying your priorities. In the Athena Swan framework, devising an effective gender action plan is not something that can be done in isolation from your self-assessment. Priorities and targeted and tailored actions flow from the unique data and analysis undertaken by each applicant. Whilst the focus of this video is on Criterion B, it is useful at this point just to be aware of where priorities show up in the other criteria. At bronze level, there is subsequently a clear link to priorities in Criterion C, a smart action plan that addresses all priority areas. The criteria I have mentioned already remain in place for higher level applications. However, for silver and gold applications, there is specific mention of actions which address intersectional equalities as identified through the applicant's priority areas, if relevant. Additionally, at these levels, applicants are expected to show progress, in Criterion D, against previously identified priorities, and evidence of a desired outcome or improvement against at least 2 for silver and 3 for gold priorities. It's worth knowing these expectations as you identify your priorities, even as a bronze level applicant. In terms of the application, key priorities are addressed in Section 2 of bronze applications and Section 3 of silver or gold applications. In either case, this section overall is about the assessment of the applicant's gender equality context. Section 2.1 or 3.1 describes how culture and practices support inclusion and belonging, whilst Section 2.2 or 3.2 is where you identify and justify your key priorities going forward. In more detail, the application should describe the identification of between 4 and 8 priorities that the department or university or institute seeks to address with future action. These are priorities for the next 5-year period and should be appropriate to the applicant's context rather than being generic, and should be justifiable based on quantitative and qualitative evidence. Applicants should also consider how their priorities address intersectional inequalities. Where appropriate, applications can carry previously identified key priorities into the upcoming award period, including the rationale for any adjustments, for example, the target or the actions identified to produce change. The key priorities are likely to themselves have multiple actions that will go towards addressing them. Other lower priority goals can also be addressed through the action plan, but the key priorities should be cross-referenced throughout the action plan. Now let's move to thinking about how to identify and articulate your priorities. Embedded within the Athena Swan framework and in the assessment criteria is an expectation that the identification of issues and related priorities will emerge from data that is analysed during the self-assessment. Applicants should reflect on their evaluation of policies, progress and culture and all data sources in the application in order to identify the key gender equality issues. This should draw on the mandatory datasets, including culture survey and any other data included as relevant, presented in Appendices 1 and 2. The evaluation should draw on insights particularly as they relate to gender equality, for example, representation and progression of people of different gender identities. To support their evaluation, applicants should consider trends or issues across job families, contract type, or functions and grades, as well as consider good practice that can be translated to other areas and any areas where improvement can be gained through future action. For the progression of PTO staff, applicants should reflect on the progression pathways available to PTO staff, drawing on evidence to inform the identification of areas of good practice and areas for improvement. Priorities are not the same as actions. Priorities are statements of the change you wish to see and are likely to have multiple actions that will go towards addressing them. As you go through consultation and finalise your priorities, you will want to develop them to be specific and detailed, measurable, appropriate and tailored to your context, clearly linked to underlying evidence, both qualitative and quantitative, and likely to be addressed through multiple actions. And above all, remember that we are thinking about priorities from a gender equality perspective. Remember that we said priorities should be specific. So here's some examples of the difference between broad priorities and specific priorities. So broad priorities might include to tackle bullying and harassment, to increase the number of women at senior academic grades, or to grow engagement with the local community. Much more specific priorities of the type that we are looking for in terms of Athena Swan applications in each of those areas might look like reduce incidences of disrespect towards professional services staff from students, improve the success rate of women achieving promotion at senior lecturer and professor grades, or work with community partners to increase the proportion of male school leavers from the area enrolling in the institution. As shown previously, you will most likely use a combination of information sources to identify your key priorities, including quantitative data analysis, culture evaluations, or assessments of progress against previous action plans. Priorities should be in areas where you are likely to make the biggest difference to gender equality. For example, key priority areas might be suggested by places where there are large gender gaps in student or staff representation, or major drop-offs in pipelines for staff or students in a particular discipline, or for professional, technical and operational staff where there are the most significant gender discrepancies in representation in particular grades or job families. And do your data compare favourably or unfavourably to wider sector benchmarks? Are there areas of concern that repeatedly occur in the culture assessment, for example via a survey or focus groups? For example, do your staff culture survey findings indicate marked differences in experience with workload and or well-being by gender, or a lack of support for promotion from managers? You might also look at areas of reversal in earlier progress. This may suggest that you need new or renewed focus and actions. There may be underlying barriers that have not yet been addressed. In setting priorities, you should consider intersectionality. For example, if you are focused on increasing representation of a particular group, have you analysed whether there are particular issues for disabled or minority ethnic staff or students who are members of that group? Throughout the identification process, you should bear in mind that the Athena Swan Charter is a gender equality charter, and therefore we are looking to define priorities for advancing gender equality. As well as things that show up in data or evaluations, there may be other possible influences on your priorities, both internal and external to your department or university. These could include external policy drivers, or statutory responsibilities. For example, gender pay gaps, Office for Students' expectations around harassment and sexual misconduct. There may be changes to the external context, particularly those that present risk or threat to your progress on gender equality. For example, COVID-19 related shifts to online home working or pressures on workload that may have gendered impacts. It can be useful to liaise with other staff across the university to explore existing institutional targets and priorities of the organisation, for example around widening access or staff wellbeing. The opportunities may arise from local initiatives or external organisations, for example learned and professional societies, to work together on gender equality issues. Taking account of external drivers when setting priorities is useful, but needs to be balanced with and contextualised by the key issues identified in the self-assessment and considered within the context of the applicant's own self-assessment. So who should set these priorities? Well, definitely not any one individual. Consultation on your key priorities is really important, not least because it can confirm that key priorities are relevant, recognised by people and shared widely, improve buy-in from stakeholders, help to understand the resource implications, and allow for sharing and learning from others who may be addressing the same or similar issues. This could provide an opportunity to pool resources and have a greater impact. Let's consider an example to help clarify what we mean by priorities. In this example, the self-assessment process has picked up 3 pieces of information around academic promotion and representation. So the evidence shows that women are significantly underrepresented at professor grades, despite gender balance at lecturer grades. So only 16% of professors are female, compared to 53% of lecturers. The staff survey feedback found that women's workload allocation was not aligned with the promotions criteria. And the staff survey also found that fewer women than men discuss promotions in appraisal meetings. So now we're going to see several suggested priorities and consider whether these meet the requirements for a priority under the Athena Swan framework. So the first suggestion for a priority is develop appraisal templates to ensure promotions are discussed in all appraisals. Well, this is specific and measurable, but it can't really be supported by multiple actions and is only partially justified by the evidence. It's likely to be insufficient to address the issue. It's been formulated without fully considering what the evidence is saying and how the different aspects link together. The second attempt at forming a priority in this area is to introduce a mentoring scheme for women senior lecturers. This is specific and measurable. It can't really be supported by multiple actions, and this is really an action itself. Whilst it's an example of generic good practice, it's not obviously been identified against the issues that the evidence is showing. A priority to increase the number of senior women in the university is much broader. It can be supported by multiple actions, but it's not very specific and it's harder to measure, and it isn't fully responding to all of the evidence. So our final attempt at articulating a priority that matches this evidence is a priority to increase the proportion of women promoted to professor. This is specific and measurable. It can be supported by multiple actions, and it ties into the evidence that suggests the issue with underrepresentation at professor grades is coming from lack of access to or unsuitability of the promotion process. Before we summarise the key points of this video, there are a few hints and tips addressing different situations that you may find yourself in. So what to do if you need to retrospectively identify some priorities in a previous action plan? First of all, why might you need to do this? The expectation for a silver application is evidence of desired outcome against at least 2 priorities. As your last application was a post-May 2015 application, you won't have formally identified priorities, so you'll need to retrospectively identify some. In most cases, you will have prioritised your previous action plan to some extent, based on the self-assessment team assessing which actions were most significant, and this can give you some indication of priorities. However, remembering how we defined priorities earlier in the video, you also need to look at your action plans for multiple actions tackling a single issue, priorities targeting specific issues rather than covering broad themes, and outcomes that are focused on gender equality. Next, what to do if you lack the resources to address a key issue affecting gender equality. So if you lack the resources in the short term to address maybe a longer term priority. In this case, you could consider if there are short and medium term priorities that would contribute to or enable the longer term priority. Finally, what to do if there is a significant equalities gap that you feel is a high priority that is not currently in your power to address. In this case, you can consider, can you raise it with those who do have the power? Or can you work with others across the sector to tackle it? Let's summarise the key points about identifying your priorities as part of your application for the transformed Athena Swan Charter. To identify your priorities, you're expected to define between 4 and 8 priorities that show commitment to accelerating progress in gender equality. This is especially important at higher level awards. They should be evidence-based. They should be targeted, specific and measurable. And these should be addressed in the action plan, likely by multiple actions. Your priorities should be recognised and shared by self-assessment team members and other relevant stakeholders, and they should be within your power to achieve or influence. At all times, remember to use your evidence, consider the context, consult and engage stakeholders, and remember the gender equality focus. Thank you for watching this video. More information on identifying priorities and other aspects of preparing an Athena Swan application can be found on the Advance HE website.